Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to the Middle Ages, to a world of castles and cathedrals, of lords and peasants and kings, and we are going to talk about something that shaped every single day of every single life in that long and distant age: rules. The medieval world was bound, hemmed and hedged about with rules, an astonishing thicket of laws and customs and obligations and prohibitions that governed almost everything a person could do, from the clothes on their back, to the bread in their hands, to the very God they were required to worship, and the precise manner in which they were required to do it. And these were not gentle rules, not mere suggestions or matters of etiquette. Many of them carried penalties of a severity that is difficult for us to imagine now, penalties that could cost a person their property, their freedom, their hand, or their life. So, before you settle in, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from in the world and what time it is. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it oddly comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the world, lying awake in the dark together, drifting back through the centuries. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. I will be here regardless, talking quietly in the dark about the long, strange history of how people used to live. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some soft background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and winding journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries to a world very different from our own. You do not need to remember any of it. Have you ever wondered what would happen to a medieval peasant who killed a deer to feed his hungry family? Have you ever wondered why an ordinary villager might be forbidden, on pain of punishment, from grinding his own corn, or fishing in his own river, or even leaving his own village without permission? Have you ever wondered what rules governed the bread you bought, the ale you drank, the clothes you wore, the days you worked, and the way you were required to spend your Sundays? These are the things we are going to drift through tonight, slowly, in the dark. The great and strange and often harsh web of rules that bound the medieval world. So settle back, let your eyes grow heavy, and let us travel together into a world where almost everything was governed, and where breaking the wrong rule could cost you everything. Let us begin with the sheer, overwhelming scale of it, with just how thoroughly the medieval world was bound by rules. To understand the medieval world, you have to abandon, first of all, our modern notion of freedom, the idea that a person is broadly at liberty to live as they please, so long as they harm no one else. That idea would have been almost incomprehensible to most people in the Middle Ages, because the medieval world was built on an entirely different principle, the principle that everyone and everything had its proper, fixed place, and that the whole purpose of law and custom was to keep each person in that place, performing the duties and obligations attached to it. Freedom, in our sense, was not the natural state of things. Order was, and order meant rules. These rules came from many directions at once, and this is part of what made the medieval world so densely governed. There was the law of the king, the law of the realm, administered through courts and officials and reaching, in theory at least, across the whole land. There was the law of the lord, the rules and customs of the manor, which governed the daily lives of the peasants who lived and worked upon it, enforced through the lord's own court. There was the law of the church, vast and pervasive, governing not only worship and belief, but marriage, morality, the calendar, and a great deal else besides, with its own courts and its own fearsome penalties. There was the law of the town, for those who lived in towns, with its regulations of trade and conduct. There was the law of the guild, for those who practiced a craft, governing how they worked and what they made. And beneath and around all of these lay the immense weight of custom, the way things had always been done, which carried an authority almost as binding as any written law. A single person might be subject to all of these at once, bound simultaneously by the king's law and the lord's law, and the church's law, and the customs of their village, each making its own demands, each carrying its own penalties. The peasant in the field was not a free agent, but a knot of obligations, owing labour to his lord, tithes to his church, taxes to his king, and obedience to the customs of his community, hemmed in on every side by what he was required to do and forbidden to do. To us, this density of obligation might feel suffocating, but to the medieval mind it was simply the natural order of a well-ordered world, the proper arrangement of a society in which everyone knew their place and their duties. And the penalties for breaking these rules ran across an enormous range, from the trivial to the terrible. At the gentler end were fines, the small monetary penalties that the manor courts and town courts handed out for the countless minor infractions of daily life, for letting your animals stray, for brewing weak ale, for failing to perform your duties properly. These fines were so common that they were almost a routine part of life, a kind of constant low-level taxation on the ordinary friction of living. But at the harsher end lay penalties of real severity, the loss of property, public humiliation, mutilation, and death, reserved for the more serious offences, and applied with a harshness that reflected a world with little patience for those who threatened its order. So as we wander through the particular rules tonight, keep this larger picture in mind, this image of a world utterly saturated with regulation, where every person lived inside a web of overlapping obligations and prohibitions, watched over by lord and king and church and custom, and where the consequences of stepping wrong could be grave indeed. It was a world bound by rules to a degree we can scarcely imagine, and the strangeness of those rules is a window into a way of life profoundly different from our own. Let that sense of a thoroughly governed world settle in the dark. We turn now to the most fundamental rules of all for most medieval people, the rules that bound them to their lord and their land. For the great majority of people in the medieval world, the peasants who worked the land, the most immediate and inescapable rules of all were those that bound them to their lord and to the manor on which they lived. This was the heart of the system we call feudalism, or more accurately, the manorial system, and it shaped the daily existence of millions of people across the centuries with a thoroughness that is hard to overstate. To be a peasant, and particularly to be an unfree peasant, a serf or villein, was to live one's whole life inside a dense net of obligation owed to the lord of the manor. The most basic of these obligations was labour. The unfree peasant did not simply farm his own land and pay rent in the modern sense. He was required to work for a set number of days upon the lord's own land, the demesne, ploughing and sowing and harvesting for the lord's benefit without payment, in addition to working his own strips of land to feed his own family. These labour services were a fundamental part of the bargain of medieval life, the price of holding one's land and one's place, and they were carefully recorded and strictly enforced. To fail to perform them, to shirk or to do them badly, was to invite the penalties of the manor court. A great deal of a peasant's working life was not his own at all, but owed, by ancient obligation, to the man who held the manor. But the obligations went far beyond labour, reaching into the smallest corners of daily life, in ways that can seem astonishing. In many places, the peasant was forbidden to grind his own grain at home, and was required instead to bring it to the lord's mill, and to pay the lord for the privilege of having it ground, a portion of the flour kept back as the miller's and the lord's due. He might be required to bake his bread in the lord's oven, again for a fee, rather than in his own home. He might be forbidden to fish in certain waters, or to gather wood from certain places, or to keep certain animals, all because these things were reserved to the lord. The lord's rights extended into the very business of feeding oneself, and to circumvent them, to grind one's own corn in a hidden hand-mill, for instance, was an offence that the manor court would punish. The peasant's very freedom of movement was constrained. An unfree peasant was, in a real sense, bound to the manor, not permitted to simply leave and seek a life elsewhere. To depart without the lord's permission was to flee, to become a fugitive, and a lord might pursue and reclaim a peasant who had run away. Even the most personal decisions of life were touched by the lord's rights. In many places, a peasant required the lord's permission and the payment of a fee for his daughter to marry, particularly if she married a man from outside the manor, since this represented a loss to the lord. When a peasant died, the lord might claim his best beast or another valuable possession as a death due. From cradle to grave, the unfree peasant lived under the lord's hand, owing labour, payment, and obedience at every turn. All of this was enforced through the manor court, the local court of the lord, which met regularly and dealt with the endless small business of manorial life, the disputes, the infractions, the failures to perform obligations, the petty offences against the custom of the manor. Here the peasant who had transgressed would answer for it, and here the fines and penalties would be handed down, recorded in the rolls of the court. It was a system of remarkable thoroughness, binding the ordinary person into a web of duty and restriction that governed their labour, their food, their movement, their family, and their property. To break these rules was rarely to risk death, in truth, but it was to risk the constant small penalties that kept the whole system turning, and to challenge the system too boldly was to risk far worse. Let that picture of the bound peasant settle in the dark. We turn now to a set of rules far harsher still, the brutal law of the king's forest. Of all the rules that bound the medieval world, few were as harsh, as resented, or as strange to modern eyes as the forest law. In many medieval kingdoms, and famously in England, vast areas of land were designated as royal forest, set aside as the hunting preserve of the king, and within these areas a special and ferocious body of law applied, a law designed to protect the king's deer and the king's hunting above the needs and even the lives of the ordinary people who lived there. It is important to understand what royal forest actually meant, because it was not simply woodland. The medieval forest, in the legal sense, was an area which might include woods but also fields, villages, and whole communities that had been placed under forest law and reserved for the king's hunting. People lived within these forests, farmed within them, tried to make their living within them, but they did so under a set of restrictions that placed the king's game and the king's greenwood above almost everything else. The forest was a place where the ordinary law of the land was suspended and replaced by something far more severe, administered by special officials and special courts, devoted to protecting the king's pleasure. The heart of the forest law was the protection of the deer, and the penalties for harming the king's game were notoriously brutal. To kill a deer in the royal forest, even a single deer, even to feed a starving family, was a grave offence that could bring down the most terrible punishments. In the harshest periods, the killing of the king's deer could be punished by mutilation, the loss of eyes or other dreadful penalties, or even by death, a human life taken in exchange for the life of a deer. This savage equation, the placing of the king's hunting above the life and limb of his subjects, struck even some contemporaries as monstrous, and the cruelty of the forest law became one of the great grievances of the age. But the forest law went far beyond the protection of deer, reaching into the daily survival of those who lived within the forest bounds. The very tools of the hunt were controlled. There were rules against keeping dogs that might chase the deer, and in some places, dogs belonging to forest dwellers had to be deliberately maimed, a process of removing claws or toes so that they could not run down the king's game. There were restrictions on clearing land, on enclosing fields, on cutting wood, on gathering what the forest offered, all designed to preserve the habitat of the deer and the integrity of the king's preserve. To take wood for your fire, to clear a patch for your crops, to let your pigs forage in the wrong place, could all fall foul of the forest law and bring penalties down upon you. The forest dweller lived hemmed in by restrictions on the most basic activities of rural life. The forest law was enforced by a hierarchy of officials, foresters and wardens and others, who patrolled the forest and brought offenders before the special forest courts. where the penalties were handed down. It was a system widely hated, a vivid symbol of the way the powerful placed their own pleasures above the needs of the common people, and the demand to soften its cruelties and reduce its extent became a recurring theme of medieval protest and reform. For the ordinary person living within the king's forest, it was simply a fact of life, a harsh and ever-present set of rules that turned the ordinary business of survival, hunting, gathering, clearing, into a minefield of potential offences, some of which could cost them their lives. Let that image of the king's forest settle in the dark, beautiful and perilous. We turn now from the forest to the marketplace, and to the rules that governed the most basic things people bought and sold. Among the most pervasive rules of medieval life were those that governed the most basic commodities of all, the bread people ate and the ale they drank. In a world where these two things were the absolute staples of existence, the foundation of nearly every diet, their quality, price, and honest measure were matters of such importance that they were regulated by law with remarkable thoroughness, and those who cheated faced public and humiliating punishment. The medieval authorities understood that bread and ale were too important to be left to the unchecked greed of those who made and sold them. A baker who sold loaves that were underweight, or made from poor or adulterated flour, was cheating the public of their very sustenance, and an alewife who watered her ale or sold it at false measure was doing the same. And so there grew up an elaborate body of regulation governing these trades, fixing the relationship between the price of grain and the weight and price of the bread and ale that could be made from it, so that as the cost of grain rose and fell, the size of the loaf or the price of the drink would adjust accordingly, protecting the buyer from being cheated. Officials were appointed to test the bread and taste the ale, to weigh the loaves and check the measures, enforcing these rules in the markets and shops of the medieval world. The penalties for breaking these rules were designed above all to humiliate, to shame the dishonest tradesman publicly before the whole community, and this public humiliation was a characteristic feature of medieval justice. A baker caught selling underweight bread might be dragged through the streets, the offending loaf hung around his neck for all to see, a public spectacle of disgrace. Dishonest tradespeople might be placed in the pillory, that wooden frame that held the head and hands, fixed in a public place where the community could see them, mock them and pelt them, a punishment that combined physical discomfort with profound public shame. The alewife who cheated her customers might face the cucking stool or similar humiliations. The whole point was to make an example, to turn the cheat into a public spectacle and a warning to others. This system reveals something important about the medieval attitude to trade and to the community. The marketplace was not seen as a free arena in which buyers and sellers struck whatever bargains they could, with the cleverest or greediest profiting most. It was seen as a moral space, governed by ideas of fairness and the common good, in which everyone was entitled to honest bread at an honest price, and in which those who exploited their neighbours deserved punishment and public shame. The regulation of bread and ale was an expression of this communal morality, an insistence that the basic necessities of life should be honestly provided, and that cheating the community in such fundamental matters was a serious offence against the whole social order. For the ordinary baker, brewer, and alewife, these rules were simply a constant condition of working life, a set of standards they were required to meet on pain of fine, humiliation, or worse. The honest tradesperson had little to fear, but the temptation to cut corners, to add a little less flour or a little more water, was always there, and the consequences of being caught were public and severe. Every loaf and every measure of ale was, in a sense, a small test of honesty, watched over by the officials of the market, and backed by the threat of the pillory. Let that image of the regulated marketplace settle in the dark, the weighed loaf and the tasted ale. We turn now to a deeper principle that lay behind all this regulation, the medieval suspicion of profit itself. Behind the detailed rules governing bread and ale and the medieval marketplace lay a profound and, to modernize, deeply strange set of ideas about money, trade and profit. Ideas that shaped medieval economic life in ways that can be hard for us to grasp. The medieval world, heavily influenced by the teachings of the Church, was deeply suspicious of profit, of buying cheap and selling dear, of the whole business of making money from money. And this suspicion was woven into the rules that governed how people were allowed to trade. At the heart of this was the idea of the just price. The medieval mind tended to believe that everything had a proper, fair price, rooted in its true value and the legitimate costs and labour involved in producing it, and that to sell something for more than this just price, to exploit scarcity or desperation or ignorance to extract a higher payment, was a kind of cheating, even a sin. The merchant who cornered a market and drove up prices, who profited from a shortage, who charged what the desperate buyer would pay rather than what the thing was truly worth, was seen not as a clever businessman but as a wrongdoer, someone who had violated the moral order of fair exchange. This idea that there was a right price and that exceeding it was wrong underlay a great deal of medieval economic regulation. From this flowed a series of rules against various practices of the marketplace that we would consider perfectly normal commerce, but that the medieval world regarded with deep suspicion. There were rules against what was called forestalling, the practice of buying up goods before they reached the public market, in order to control and raise their price. There were rules against regrating, buying goods in the market and reselling them at a higher price in the same market. There were rules against engrossing, buying up large quantities of a commodity to corner the market and drive up the price. All of these practices, which amount to much of what we would simply call trading and speculation, were treated as offences against the common good, attempts to manipulate prices and profit at the expense of the ordinary buyer, and they were punished accordingly. Most striking of all to modern eyes was the medieval attitude to lending money at interest, which was condemned as the sin of usury. To lend money and to charge interest for the loan, to make money simply from the use of money, was regarded by the medieval church as sinful, a violation of the proper order of things, and it was forbidden to Christians. This prohibition had enormous consequences, shaping the whole financial life of the medieval world, pushing the necessary business of lending into the margins and into the hands of those outside the Christian prohibition, and surrounding the entire activity of finance with moral anxiety and legal restriction. The idea that one should not profit from lending, that money should not breed money, was a fundamental principle, however much it was evaded and worked around in practice. These ideas and the rules that flowed from them reveal a world with a fundamentally different understanding of economic life from our own. A world in which the pursuit of profit was not celebrated as enterprise, but suspected as greed, in which the market was meant to serve fairness and the common good, rather than the accumulation of wealth, and in which a whole range of ordinary commercial activities were treated as offences. For the medieval trader, this meant working within a framework that regarded the very impulse to maximise profit as morally dangerous, and that stood ready to punish those who pursued it too openly. It was a system rooted in a vision of economic life as a moral matter, governed by fairness rather than freedom, and it produced rules that can seem to us almost the opposite of common sense. Let that strange moral economy settle in the dark. We turn now from the marketplace to the calendar, and to the rules that govern time itself. One of the most pervasive and least appreciated ways in which the medieval world was governed by rules concerned time itself, the calendar, the week, the year, and above all the question of when a person was and was not permitted to work. For the modern mind, accustomed to deciding our own schedules, it can be startling to realize how thoroughly the rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the Church and its calendar of holy days, and how the simple matter of whether you could labor on a given day was a matter of religious rule, enforced by real penalties. The fundamental rule was the observance of Sunday and of the many holy days scattered throughout the year. Sunday, the Lord's Day, was to be kept holy, and this meant, among other things, that ordinary servile labour was forbidden. A peasant was not supposed to plough or reap or perform his usual heavy work on a Sunday, which was reserved for worship and rest. But Sunday was only the beginning. The medieval calendar was studded with holy days, the feasts of the church, the days of the saints, the great festivals of the religious year, and on many of these too, ordinary work was forbidden or restricted. When you add them all up, the number of days on which a medieval person was supposed to refrain from their usual labour was considerable, a substantial portion of the year given over, by religious rule, to observance and rest rather than work. This might sound pleasant, a generous allowance of holidays, but it was not simply a matter of free choice. The observance of these days was a religious obligation, enforced by the moral authority of the Church, and, in various ways, by real consequences. To work when work was forbidden, to plough on a holy day or labour when one should have been at worship, was an offence, a violation of the sacred order of time, and it could bring punishment, whether the disapproval of the community, the penance imposed by the Church, or other sanctions. The calendar was not a menu of optional festivals, but a binding framework that dictated the rhythm of work and rest, and stepping outside it was to transgress. Equally binding was the requirement to attend church, to be present at worship on Sundays and holy days, to participate in the religious life of the community. This was not understood as a personal choice but as a duty, an expectation that everyone would take their place in the worshipping community, and absence could be noted and questioned. The medieval person's week was structured around these religious obligations: the regular attendance at church, the observance of the holy days, the keeping of the sacred rhythm of time, all of it a matter of rule and duty rather than free decision. Time itself belonged, in a sense, to the Church, parcelled out into working days and holy days, according to a calendar that no ordinary person had any power to alter. When we step back and consider this, we see how completely the medieval world was governed even in its experience of time, how the basic question of when one could work and when one must rest and worship was answered not by individual choice or economic need, but by religious rule, binding on all. The rhythm of the medieval year, with its alternation of labour and festival, work and holy day, was a structure imposed from above, a sacred ordering of time that shaped every life, and that carried, behind its festivals and observances, the weight of obligation and the threat of consequence for those who failed to keep it. Let that sense of governed time settle in the dark, the working days and the holy days marching in their fixed procession. We turn now to the deepest and most dangerous rules of all, the rules governing what a person was permitted to believe. Of all the rules that bound the medieval world, none reached deeper or carried more terrible consequences than those governing belief itself. For in the medieval world, religious belief was not a private matter of individual conscience, as we tend to think of it today, but a public matter of the most fundamental importance, regulated, enforced, and policed, in which holding the wrong beliefs, or expressing them, could place a person in mortal danger. The medieval person was required not only to act correctly, but to believe correctly, and the rules of belief were enforced with a seriousness that reflected how much was thought to be at stake. The medieval church taught a body of doctrine that was held to be the revealed truth, necessary for salvation, and to depart from this doctrine, to hold beliefs the church had condemned as false, was the offence of heresy. Heresy was regarded as among the gravest of all offences, far worse than many crimes against persons or property, because it was seen as a kind of spiritual poison, a threat to the souls of others and to the entire Christian order, a betrayal of the most important truths there were. The heretic was not seen as a harmless eccentric with unusual opinions, but as a dangerous corrupter, whose false beliefs could spread and damn others, and who therefore had to be confronted, corrected, and if necessary, destroyed. The stakes, in the medieval understanding, could not have been higher, for they concerned the eternal fate of souls. To enforce correct belief, the Church developed courts and procedures designed to identify, examine, and deal with those suspected of heresy. Those accused might be questioned, pressed to recant their errors, and return to orthodox belief, and those who confessed and repented might be reconciled, often after performing penance. But those who persisted in their heresy, who refused to abandon their condemned beliefs, faced the most severe consequences. The Church itself did not carry out the ultimate penalties, but handed the obstinate heretic over to the secular authorities, who could and did impose the terrible punishment of death, often by burning. The burning of heretics, though it varied greatly in frequency across time and place, stands as one of the starkest expressions of how seriously the medieval world took the rules of belief, willing to take a human life to defend the purity of doctrine. Alongside heresy stood the related offense of blasphemy, the irreverent or contemptuous treatment of sacred things, of God, of holy persons and objects, which was likewise regarded as a serious offense to be punished. To speak against God, to mock the sacred, to use holy names profanely, was not merely bad manners, but a genuine transgression against the divine order, and it could bring punishment upon the offender. The medieval world surrounded the sacred with a wall of rules, protecting it from irreverence and insult, and treating offences against it with grave seriousness. One had to be careful, in such a world, not only in what one believed, but in how one spoke of holy things. The rules of belief reveal, perhaps more than any others, just how different the medieval world was from our own, how the modern notions of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech would have been not merely unknown, but actively rejected, seen as dangerous license to spread spiritual poison. In a world that believed with utter conviction that correct belief was necessary for eternal salvation and that false belief threatened the souls of all, the policing of belief seemed not tyranny but necessity, a grave duty to protect the faithful from damnation. For the medieval person, this meant living in a world where one's very thoughts and words about the deepest matters were subject to rule, and where stepping too far outside the bounds of orthodoxy could lead, in the end, to the fire. Let that sober reality settle in the dark. We turn now to a gentler but still pervasive set of rules, those governing what people were permitted to wear and eat. The medieval world reached even into the most intimate and necessary act of all, the eating of food, and surrounded it with rules, particularly the rules of fasting and abstinence laid down by the Church. For the medieval Christian, what one ate and when one ate it was not merely a matter of taste or hunger or availability, but a matter of religious obligation, governed by a calendar of fasts and abstinences that dictated, on a great many days of the year, what foods were permitted and what were forbidden. The central principle was the regular abstinence from certain foods, above all meat, on particular days and during particular seasons. Fridays, in commemoration of the day of Christ's death, were days of abstinence on which the eating of meat was forbidden. Beyond the weekly Friday abstinence, there were other days through the week and year on which meat was to be avoided, and above all there was the great season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, during which a strict and prolonged fast was observed, with meat and often other animal products forbidden across the whole long period. When all the fast days and days of abstinence are counted up, they amounted to a very substantial portion of the year, during which the medieval Christian was bound by religious rule to abstain from the richest and most desired foods. On the days when meat was forbidden, fish took its place as the permitted food, and this gave fish an enormous importance in the medieval diet and economy, the necessary substitute that allowed people to eat while observing the rules of abstinence. The great number of fast days created a steady, religiously mandated demand for fish, shaping fisheries and trade, and the patterns of medieval eating. To eat fish on a fast day was to keep the rule, and the whole structure of medieval food was bent around this alternation between the days when meat was allowed and the many days when it was not. between feasting and fasting, indulgence and abstinence. These were not merely customs or suggestions, but genuine obligations, backed by the moral authority of the church and the expectations of the community. To eat meat on a forbidden day, to break the fast of Lent, was a transgression, a sin against the discipline of the church, and it could bring penance, censure, or worse upon the offender. The keeping of the fasts was a visible mark of religious observance and belonging, and their breaking a visible mark of transgression. The medieval person's diet was thus governed by the calendar in the same way as their work, divided into permitted and forbidden according to a sacred scheme that no individual had the authority to set aside. When we consider this, we see once again how completely the medieval world was bound by rules, reaching even into the contents of the cooking pot and the rhythm of eating across the year. The simple question of whether one could eat a piece of meat on a given day was answered not by appetite or choice, but by the religious calendar, binding on all the faithful, a discipline of the body undertaken for the good of the soul. It is one more example of a world in which the most ordinary and necessary activities of life, eating, working, believing, were hedged about with obligation and rule. Let that picture of the governed table settle in the dark, the meat days and the fish days in their sacred alternation. We turn now to the rules that governed the clothes upon people's backs. The medieval world, like the Tudor world that followed it, held firmly to the idea that society was divided into ranks and orders, each with its proper place, and that these distinctions should be visible, written upon the body in the clothes a person wore. And so, in various times and places across the Middle Ages, there were rules and attempts to regulate dress according to status, to ensure that people dressed in accordance with their rank and did not presume to wear finery above their station. The clothing of the medieval person was, at least in principle and in aspiration, a matter of social rule as well as personal choice. The thinking behind these rules was rooted in the medieval vision of a divinely ordered society, in which everyone had their appointed place, and the distinctions between ranks were part of the natural and proper order of things. Dress was one of the most visible markers of these distinctions, a way of telling at a glance who was who stood where in the great hierarchy. The fine furs, the rich fabrics, the bright and costly colours, the precious ornaments, these were understood to belong properly to the great, to the nobility and the wealthy, and for a person of lower rank to dress in such things was to blur the distinctions, to claim a status not theirs, to disrupt the visible order of society. Rules governing dress sought to preserve these distinctions, to keep the marks of rank where they belonged. These rules tended to reserve the finest things for the highest ranks, restricting the use of certain costly furs, certain rich fabrics, certain colours, and certain ornaments to those of sufficient status, and forbidding their use by those below. The merchant grown wealthy but not nobly born, the prosperous commoner with money to spend, might find that the law sought to prevent them from dressing as finely as their wealth allowed, holding them to the dress appropriate to their birth rather than their riches. As in the later Tudor period, much of the anxiety behind these rules came from social mobility, from the rise of people whose wealth outran their birth, and who expressed their success through fine clothing, threatening to blur the lines the rules sought to preserve. In practice, these rules were difficult to enforce and often widely ignored, as such rules tend to be, and their effectiveness varied greatly. The desire to dress finely, to display one's prosperity, and to reach above one's station was a powerful and persistent force, and the rules struggled against it with limited success. But the very existence of these rules, the repeated attempts to regulate dress by rank, tells us something important about the medieval mind, about its deep attachment to a visibly ordered society, and its anxiety about anything that threatened to blur the distinctions of status. The clothes a person wore were understood to carry meaning, to make a statement about their place in the world, and that statement was, ideally, to be controlled. So the medieval person's very appearance was, In principle, a matter touched by rule, another aspect of life that the ordered society sought to govern in accordance with its vision of proper hierarchy. Whether or not the rules were obeyed, they expressed the characteristic medieval conviction that society was a structure of fixed ranks, that these ranks should be visible, and that the proper ordering of appearance was part of the proper ordering of the world. It is one more thread in the dense web of rules that bound the medieval person, reaching even to the cut and colour of their coat. Let that image of the regulated wardrobe settle in the dark. We turn now to the rules that governed those who worked at a craft, the powerful grip of the guilds. For those who lived in the towns of the medieval world and practiced a craft or trade, there was another powerful source of rules to add to all the others: the guild. The guilds were associations of craftsmen and tradesmen, organised by trade, that came to exercise an extraordinary degree of control over the working lives of their members and over the practice of their crafts, governing who could work, how they could work, what they could make, and how they could sell it, with a thoroughness that shaped the entire economic life of the medieval town. The most fundamental power of the guild was control over entry to the trade. In a town where a guild governed a particular craft, one could not simply set up as a practitioner of that craft at will. One had to belong to the guild, and to belong to the guild one had to pass through its prescribed path, typically beginning as an apprentice, bound for a term of years to a master who would teach the craft, then advancing to the status of a journeyman who worked for wages, and finally, perhaps, becoming a master in one's own right, able to open a workshop and take on apprentices. This whole progression was governed by the rules of the guild, and to practice the craft outside this structure, without belonging to the guild and following its path, was forbidden. The guild held the gate to the trade, and decided who could pass through. Beyond controlling entry, the guild regulated the practice of the craft in great detail. It set standards for the quality of the work, insisting that goods be made properly and well, and punishing those who produced shoddy or fraudulent work that might damage the reputation of the whole trade. It often regulated the methods of production, the materials to be used, the hours that could be worked. It frequently sought to control prices and to prevent excessive competition among its members, aiming not at the free competition of the modern market, but at a kind of ordered fairness in which all the masters of a trade could make a reasonable living. The guild aimed to govern its craft as a whole, maintaining standards, limiting competition, and protecting the collective interests and reputation of its members. The guild also enforced its rules with real authority over its members, who were bound to obey the regulations of their guild, on pain of fines and other penalties. The craftsman who broke the rules, who produced bad work, who worked when he should not, who competed unfairly with his fellows, who failed in his obligations to the guild, would answer for it and face the consequences. The guild was thus another court, another source of rule and discipline, governing the working life of the medieval townsman, in addition to all the other authorities that claimed his obedience. To practice a craft in a medieval town was to live under the detailed governance of one's guild, bound by its rules at every turn. The guilds reveal yet another dimension of the densely regulated medieval world, the way that even the practice of a trade, the making and selling of goods, was hedged about with rules and controlled by a governing body. Far from the modern ideal of free enterprise, in which anyone may set up in business and compete as they please, the medieval craft was a closely governed activity, entry restricted, methods regulated, quality enforced, competition limited, all under the authority of the guild. For the medieval craftsman, the guild was both a protection and a constraint, a source of security and standing, but also a web of rules that governed his working life as thoroughly as the Lord governed the peasant, or the church governed the believer. Let that image of the governed craft settle in the dark. We turn now to a rule that governed the night itself, the ringing of the curfew bell. As darkness fell over the medieval town, a bell would ring, and that ringing carried the force of a rule that governed the night. This was the curfew, one of the most characteristic regulations of medieval urban life, a rule that sought to bring order to the dangerous hours of darkness by requiring people to damp down their fires, retreat into their homes, and stay off the streets once night had fallen. The very word curfew comes from an old expression meaning to cover the fire, and it captures the original purpose of the rule. The covering of the fire was, in its origin, a serious practical concern in a world built largely of timber and thatch, where a single unattended fire could spread and consume whole streets and neighborhoods. The medieval town was acutely vulnerable to fire, and a blaze that broke out in the night, when people slept and there was no one to fight it, could be catastrophic. The curfew rule required that, at the ringing of the bell, household fires be covered or extinguished, banked down for the night, so that they could not flare up and spread while the household slept. This was a sensible precaution against a real and ever-present danger, an attempt to reduce the risk of the nighttime fires that could destroy a town. But the curfew came to mean more than just the covering of fires. It came to mark the hour after which people were expected to be off the streets and within their homes, the boundary of the ordered day beyond which movement through the town was restricted and suspect. The night was a dangerous time, associated with crime, disorder, and wrongdoing, and the medieval authorities sought to control it by clearing the streets after curfew, treating those who wandered abroad in the night, without good reason, with suspicion. To be out and about after the curfew bell, to be a night walker, was to invite question and suspicion, and the watch that patrolled the town might challenge and detain those who roamed the streets in the forbidden hours. The night belonged, in a sense, to sleep and to order, and those who violated its peace were regarded as up to no good. The curfew thus combined a practical concern with fire, and a deeper concern with order and security, an attempt to govern the dangerous hours of darkness and bring them under the same discipline that ruled the day. It reflects the medieval anxiety about disorder, the sense that the night was a time of particular danger that needed to be controlled, and the willingness of the authorities to regulate even the hours of darkness, to dictate when fires should be covered and when people should be within doors. The ringing of the curfew bell was the sound of this rule, a nightly signal that the ordered day was ending and that the time had come to retreat, to bank the fire and bar the door, and leave the dark streets empty. For the medieval town dweller, the curfew was simply part of the rhythm of life, the nightly boundary that marked the end of the day's activity and the beginning of the hours of rest and confinement. It is one more example of how thoroughly the medieval world was governed, reaching even into the night, dictating the covering of fires and the clearing of streets, governing the hours of darkness as it governed the hours of light. The bell that rang across the rooftops at dusk was the voice of a world that sought to order everything, even the night. Let that sound settle in the dark, the curfew bell ringing over the sleeping town. We turn now to the strange and ancient ways in which the medieval world determined guilt and innocence. When a person in the early medieval world was accused of a crime and their guilt was uncertain, the question of how to determine the truth was answered in ways that seem, to the modern mind, profoundly strange. For in an age of deep religious faith and limited means of investigation, one of the methods used to establish guilt or innocence was the trial by ordeal, a procedure that called upon God himself to reveal the truth through a physical test, trusting that the divine would protect the innocent and condemn the guilty. The logic of the ordeal rested on the medieval conviction that God was an active presence in the world, intimately concerned with human affairs, and willing to intervene to reveal the truth and defend the innocent. If a person's guilt could not be determined by ordinary means, then the matter could be placed in God's hands through a test, whose outcome God would control, revealing the truth through the result. The ordeal was thus a kind of appeal to divine judgment, a way of asking God directly to show whether the accused was guilty or innocent. and it was surrounded with religious ritual and solemnity, conducted under the supervision of the church, framed as a sacred procedure rather than a mere physical trial. The forms of the ordeal varied. In the ordeal by hot iron, the accused might be required to carry a piece of heated iron for a distance, after which the wound would be bound and examined some days later. If it was healing cleanly, this was taken as a sign of innocence, and if it festered, a sign of guilt. In the ordeal by water, the accused might be bound and lowered into water that had been blessed, with the outcome interpreted according to whether they sank or floated, the reading of the result resting on complex and now alien reasoning about the blessed water and the body. These procedures, strange and harsh as they appear to us, were understood at the time as genuine means of discovering the truth, mechanisms through which the divine judgment could be made manifest in the physical world. To our eyes, these methods seem not only cruel but irrational, incapable of actually determining guilt or innocence in any reliable way. But it is important to understand them within the medieval worldview, in which the active intervention of God in human affairs was taken for granted, and in which the appeal to divine judgment seemed a reasonable, even a pious way of resolving questions that human means could not. The ordeal was not seen as a barbaric absurdity, but as a solemn and sacred procedure, a way of bringing the certainty of divine knowledge to bear on the uncertainty of human justice. It reflected a world in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and in which God was expected to take a hand in the affairs of men. In time, the ordeal fell out of use, as the Church withdrew its support for the practice and as other methods of determining guilt, including the use of juries, gradually took its place. But for a long period it stood as one of the characteristic procedures of medieval justice, a vivid expression of the religious worldview that underlay the whole medieval order, in which even the determination of guilt and innocence was referred, in the hardest cases, to the judgment of God. It reminds us how different the medieval understanding of truth, evidence, and justice could be from our own, how thoroughly it was shaped by faith, and how the rules that governed even the gravest matters of life and death rested on assumptions we no longer share. Let that strange and solemn picture settle in the dark. We turn now to the way the medieval world made every person their neighbour's keeper. One of the most ingenious and, to modernize, oppressive features of medieval social regulation was the way it made people collectively responsible for one another, binding them into groups that were held answerable for each member's conduct, so that the maintenance of order became not merely the business of officials, but the shared obligation of the whole community, watching and policing itself. In a world without anything resembling a modern police force, this system of mutual responsibility was a central means of keeping order, and it placed a remarkable burden of obligation upon ordinary people. In many places, the men of a community were organized into small groups, each member of which was held responsible for the good conduct of the others. If one member of such a group committed an offense and fled, the others could be held answerable, required to produce him, or to pay a penalty for his escape. This system of collective responsibility meant that every man had a direct and personal stake in the good behavior of his neighbors, an incentive to watch them, to keep them in order, and to ensure they did not bring trouble upon the group. It turned the whole community into a network of mutual surveillance and responsibility, each man bound to the conduct of those around him, each group a small unit of collective accountability. To belong to such a group was itself often a requirement, so that a man who belonged to none was regarded with suspicion as someone outside the web of responsibility. Linked to this was the obligation to join in the pursuit of wrongdoers, the duty known as raising and following the hue and cry. When a crime was committed and the criminal fled, those who witnessed it or were called upon were obliged to raise the alarm and join in the chase, to pursue the fleeing offender with shouts and with whatever came to hand, the whole community turning out to run down the wrongdoer. To fail to join the hue and cry when it was raised, to stand aside while a criminal escaped, was itself an offence, a failure of one's communal duty. The pursuit of criminals was thus not left to officials, but imposed upon everyone, a shared obligation that turned the community into its own instrument of justice, bound to rise up and give chase when the alarm was raised. This system reveals a profound difference between the medieval approach to order and our own. In the modern world, we tend to think of the maintenance of order as the responsibility of professionals, the police and the courts, while ordinary citizens are largely free of any obligation to police one another. The medieval world placed the burden squarely upon the community itself, binding people into groups responsible for each other's conduct, requiring them to watch, to control, and to pursue, making the maintenance of order a shared and inescapable duty. It was a system that left little room for privacy or for minding one's own business, that made every person their neighbour's keeper, answerable for those around them, and obliged to act against wrongdoers. For the medieval person, this meant living under the constant mutual watchfulness of the community, bound into a web of shared responsibility from which there was little escape. One's neighbours were not merely neighbours, but, in a sense, one's guardians, and one's responsibility, the conduct of each, entangled with the conduct of all. It was another of the many ways in which the medieval world bound its people, not only through the rules of lord and king and church, but through the obligations they owed to one another, the mutual watching and answering that held the community together and kept it in order. Let that image of the watchful community settle in the dark. We turn now to the fate of those who fell entirely outside the protection of the law. Among the most severe fates that could befall a person in the medieval world was to be placed outside the law altogether, to be declared an outlaw, stripped of the law's protection, and cast out from the community of those whom the law defended. This was a punishment of terrible weight in a world where the law's protection was the difference between safety and utter vulnerability, and it reveals, in its starkness, what it meant to live inside or outside the bounds of the medieval legal order. To understand outlawry, we have to understand that the law, in the medieval conception, was not only a set of restrictions but also a shield, a protection that the community extended to its members, guarding their lives and their property, and giving them recourse when they were wronged. To be within the law was to be under this protection, to have one's life and goods defended, to be able to seek justice. The outlaw was cast out from all of this. Declared to be outside the law, he lost its protection entirely, and in the harshest understanding of the status, he could be killed by anyone with impunity, hunted down like an animal, his life forfeit and unprotected, his goods seized. To be an outlaw was, in a sense, to cease to be a member of the community at all, to become a hunted thing beyond the pale of human society. Outlawry was often the consequence of flight from justice, of failing to appear to answer an accusation, of refusing to submit to the legal process. The person who fled rather than face the court, who would not come to answer for an alleged crime, might be declared an outlaw for their defiance, their refusal to submit to the law, placing them outside its protection. In this way, outlawry served as a mechanism for dealing with those who evaded justice, a way of bringing consequences upon those who could not be brought before the court, declaring them beyond the law's defence, and exposing them to its full severity. The threat of outlawry was a powerful incentive to submit to the legal process rather than flee. The condition of the outlaw was a desperate one, cut off from the protection and the community of ordinary society, exposed to danger, unable to seek justice or rely on the law's defence. Some outlaws fled to the wild places, the forests and wastelands, living beyond the reach of ordinary society, and the figure of the outlaw in the greenwood became a powerful image in the medieval imagination, romanticized in tale and legend, even as the reality was usually grim. To be cast out of the law was to lose everything that the law provided, to fall from the protected community into a state of utter exposure and danger, a fate that reflected the medieval understanding of the law as a precious protection that could be withdrawn as the ultimate sanction. Outlawry reveals, from another angle, just how much it meant to live within the web of medieval rules and obligations. For all that the rules constrained and bound the medieval person, they also protected, offering the security and recourse of the law to those who lived within them. To be cast out, to be placed beyond the law, was to lose that protection entirely, and the severity of this fate shows how fundamental the law's protection was to medieval life. The web of rules was also a web of safety, and to be expelled from it was among the most terrible of punishments, leaving a person alone and unprotected in a dangerous world. Let that stark image settle in the dark, the outlaw beyond the protection of the law. We turn now to one last refuge that the medieval world offered even to the hunted, the ancient right of sanctuary. In a world of harsh rules and severe punishments, of outlawry and execution and the relentless pursuit of wrongdoers, there existed one remarkable institution that offered even the hunted and the guilty a measure of refuge, a pause in the machinery of justice, a place where the pursuing hand could not reach. This was sanctuary, the ancient right by which a person fleeing justice could find protection within the sacred space of a church, and it stands as one of the most distinctive and revealing features of the medieval order. The principle of sanctuary rested on the sacredness of holy places, on the idea that the church was God's ground, a consecrated space set apart from the ordinary world, where the violence and pursuit of secular justice should not intrude. A fugitive who reached a church and claimed sanctuary placed himself under the protection of the holy place and of God, and to drag him out by force, to violate the sanctuary, was a grave offence against the sacred, a sacrilege that few were willing to commit. Within the church, the fugitive was, for a time, safe from those who pursued him, protected by the holiness of the ground on which he stood. The sacred space threw its mantle of protection even over the guilty, holding back the secular law at the church door. Sanctuary was not, however, a permanent escape from justice, but rather a temporary refuge that opened certain limited paths. The fugitive who had claimed sanctuary could not remain in the church forever, and the medieval system provided procedures for what came next. In some cases, the person who had taken sanctuary might confess their crime and choose to abjure the realm, that is, to swear to leave the kingdom entirely, departing into permanent exile in exchange for their life, making their way to a port and taking ship to a foreign land, never to return. By this means, the sanctuary seeker escaped the ultimate penalty, but at the cost of banishment from their home and country, a heavy price but a lesser one than death. The refuge of the church thus offered not freedom, but an alternative, a way out of the immediate jaws of justice into exile. The institution of sanctuary reveals the complex interplay between the sacred and the secular in the medieval world, the way the authority of the church and the holiness of consecrated space could check and limit the reach of secular justice. It reflected the deep medieval reverence for holy places and the sense that there were limits even to the pursuit of the guilty, that the sacred could offer refuge that the secular power was bound to respect. It was a remarkable thing, this island of protection in a sea of harsh justice, a place where even the hunted could find a pause and a choice, under the protection of God and His Church. And it reminds us that the medieval world, for all its severity, was not without its mercies and its complexities, its checks upon the relentless machinery of rule and punishment. For the desperate fugitive, sanctuary could mean the difference between death and life, even if that life was to be lived in exile. It was a thread of mercy and refuge woven into the harsh fabric of medieval justice, an expression of the power of the sacred to limit the secular, and a reminder that the medieval order, dense with rules and severe in its punishments, also contained spaces of protection and pause. Let that image of the church refuge settle in the dark, the fugitive safe for a time upon the holy ground. We turn now to consider the special rules and burdens placed upon those who stood at the margins of medieval society. The medieval world, so concerned with order and with everyone knowing their proper place, reserved a particular set of rules for those who stood at its margins, the people who, for one reason or another, fell outside the ordinary community and were marked as different, set apart, and subjected to special restrictions. These rules of the margins are among the harder aspects of the medieval order to contemplate, for they reveal the darker side of a society obsessed with categorization and with the marking of difference, and they fell upon people who were often among the most vulnerable. The medieval impulse to order society extended to the marking out of those considered different or dangerous. And one characteristic method was to require such people to be visibly distinguished, to wear particular marks or signs or clothing that set them apart from the general population, so that their difference would be apparent to all. This visible marking served the medieval desire for a legible social order in which everyone could be placed at a glance, but it also served to separate, to stigmatize, and to exclude, to draw a clear and visible line between those who belonged to the ordinary community and those who did not. The requirement to be visibly marked was a powerful tool of separation, and it was applied to various groups who stood outside the mainstream of medieval Christian society. Among those subjected to special rules were people suffering from certain diseases that the medieval world feared, particularly the affliction commonly called leprosy, which inspired great dread. Those identified with this condition were often required to live apart from the general community, set outside the ordinary bounds of society, and in some places they were required to give warning of their approach, to carry some object that would make a sound and alert others to their coming, so that the healthy could keep their distance. The person marked by such a condition was, in effect, removed from ordinary society, required to live under restrictions that set them permanently apart, their affliction transforming them into an outsider governed by special and isolating rules. It was a hard fate, reflecting the fears of a world that did not understand disease and responded to it with separation and exclusion. Other groups too found themselves subject to special rules and restrictions, marked out as different, governed by particular requirements that did not apply to the general population, restricted in where they could live, what they could do, how they had to present themselves. The medieval order, with its vision of a single Christian community bound by shared faith and shared rules, tended to treat those who fell outside that community with suspicion and to govern them through restriction and the requirement of visible difference. These rules of the margins reflected the medieval anxiety about difference and the desire to maintain a clear and ordered separation between those who belonged and those who did not, and they often bore harshly upon those they touched. It is important to look honestly at this aspect of the medieval world, neither exaggerating nor excusing it, but recognizing it as part of the truth of that age. The same impulse to order and to categorize that produced the web of rules binding the whole of society also produced these harder rules of the margins, the marking and separation of those deemed different, the restrictions placed upon the vulnerable and the excluded. It is a reminder that the medieval passion for order had a darker side, that the desire for a legible and bounded community could fall heavily upon those who stood outside it, and that the web of rules that bound the medieval world could become, for some, a web of stigma and exclusion. Let that sober reflection settle quietly in the dark. We turn now to a rule of a very different kind, the duty of ordinary men to be ready for war. Among the many obligations that bound the medieval person, one of the more striking to modern eyes was the duty, placed upon ordinary free men, to possess weapons and armor, and to be ready to take up arms in defense of the realm. Far from the modern situation in which the bearing of arms and the business of war are matters for professionals, and are often tightly restricted for ordinary people, the medieval world frequently required its ordinary men to be armed, to maintain weapons appropriate to their station, and to be prepared to serve when called upon. The logic of this lay in the nature of medieval warfare and defense, which depended not only on professional warriors, the knights and men-at-arms of the noble class, but on the broader mass of ordinary men who could be summoned to fight when the kingdom was threatened. To ensure that this reserve of fighting men was ready and equipped, there were rules requiring free men to provide themselves with arms and armour according to their wealth and status. The more prosperous required to maintain more substantial equipment, the humbler required at least to possess some basic weapons. These requirements aimed to guarantee that, when the need arose, the men of the realm could be called out already equipped and ready to serve, a populace armed and prepared for the defence of the land. The possession of arms was thus not merely a right but a duty, an obligation laid upon the free men of the kingdom. Connected to this was, in some places and times, the requirement to practice the skills of war, and above all, the famous requirement to practice archery. In lands where the bow was a crucial weapon of war, ordinary men might be required to train regularly in its use, to keep up their skill so that they would be effective in battle when called upon. There were rules in some places directing men to practice at the butts, to devote time to archery practice, particularly on the days of rest when they were free from labour, so that the kingdom would have a body of skilled archers ready for war. The mastery of the bow was a matter of such military importance that its practice could be made a matter of obligation. The ordinary man required to hone his skill with the weapon for the good of the realm. Other amusements that might distract men from this vital practice could even be discouraged or forbidden, so that they would devote their leisure to the bow. This duty to bear arms and to train for war reflects the nature of the medieval state and the medieval understanding of the obligations of the subject. The defence of the realm was a shared responsibility, resting not only on the professional warrior class, but on the broad body of free men who could be called upon to fight, and who were therefore required to be armed and ready. It was another of the obligations that bound the medieval person, another duty owed to the wider order, the requirement to maintain weapons, to keep up one's skill, to be prepared to serve and fight when the kingdom called. The free man was not merely a worker but a potential soldier, bound by his obligation to be ready for war. For the ordinary medieval man, this meant that the business of arms and war was not remote and professionalized, but a part of his own obligations, a duty he carried as a member of the community of free men. He was required to possess his weapons, perhaps to practice his archery, to be ready to answer the call to arms, his role as a potential defender of the realm, woven into the web of duties that governed his life. It is one more example of the density of medieval obligation, reaching even into the requirement to be armed and ready for war, and it reflects a world in which the defence of the community was the shared responsibility of all its free members. Let that image of the armed populace settle in the dark. We turn now to the rules that governed the most intimate of human bonds, the rules of marriage. The medieval world reached into the most intimate dimension of human life, the joining of man and woman in marriage, and surrounded it with an elaborate body of rules administered above all by the Church, which claimed authority over marriage as a sacred matter. Far from being a simple private arrangement between two people or two families, medieval marriage was governed by religious law, hedged about with requirements and prohibitions, and policed by the courts of the Church, which concerned themselves with who could marry whom and how, and whether a given union was valid. Among the most important of the Church's rules were those forbidding marriage between people too closely related, the prohibited degrees of kinship within which marriage was not permitted. The Church drew these boundaries widely, forbidding marriage not only between close blood relations, but extending the prohibition through more distant relationships, and even through relationships created by marriage and other bonds. A couple who fell within these prohibited degrees could not validly marry, and a marriage discovered to be within them could be challenged and annulled. These rules created a complex web of restriction around the choice of a marriage partner, requiring that the parties not be related in any of the forbidden ways. and they could have significant consequences, particularly among the nobility, where the question of whether a marriage fell within the prohibited degrees could become entangled with matters of politics and inheritance. The Church also sought to regulate how marriages were made, to bring them out of the shadows and into the open, under the eye of the community and the Church. There was concern about clandestine marriages, unions made secretly without proper witness or public knowledge, which could lead to disputes and uncertainties about whether a valid marriage existed. To address this, the Church encouraged and required certain procedures, such as the public announcement of an intended marriage beforehand, the calling of the banns, so that the community would know of the coming union and any impediment to it could be raised. The aim was to ensure that marriages were public, witnessed, and properly made, rather than secret and uncertain, and to bring the making of marriage under the orderly governance of the Church. Beyond the making of marriage, the Church courts concerned themselves with the conduct of married life and with sexual morality more broadly, claiming authority over matters that we would consider intensely private. Adultery and other sexual offences were matters for the Church courts, which could summon, examine, and punish those accused of breaching the rules of marital fidelity and sexual morality, imposing penances and public humiliations upon offenders. The medieval Church thus extended its governance deep into the private lives of ordinary people, policing their sexual conduct, their fidelity, and their adherence to the rules of marriage, treating these intimate matters as proper subjects of religious law and discipline. The bedroom was not beyond the reach of the rules. The rules of marriage reveal yet again how thoroughly the medieval world was governed, reaching even into the most intimate and personal of human relationships, surrounding the joining of man and woman with religious law and subjecting the conduct of married life to the discipline of the Church courts. Marriage was not a private matter but a sacred and regulated one, bound by prohibitions and requirements, watched over by the Church, its making and its conduct alike subject to rule. For the medieval person, even the choice of a spouse and the conduct of married life were matters touched by the great web of medieval regulation, governed by rules that reached into the very heart of private existence. Let that picture of the governed marriage settle in the dark. We turn now to a set of rules born of catastrophe, the harsh laws that followed the Great Plague. In the middle of the 14th century, a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale swept across the medieval world. The great pestilence we remember as the Black Death, which killed an enormous portion of the population in a few terrible years. This catastrophe transformed the medieval world in many ways, and among its consequences was a set of harsh new rules concerning labour, born of the upheaval the plague had caused, and reflecting the determination of the powerful to preserve the old order against the pressures the disaster had unleashed. The logic of these rules lay in the demographic shock the plague had caused. With so many dead, labour suddenly became scarce, and the ordinary workings of supply and demand meant that those who survived to work could command higher wages and better conditions, their labour now precious, where before there had been a surplus of hands. Workers found themselves, for the first time, in a position of relative strength, able to demand more for their labour, to move in search of better terms, to improve their lot. This shift threatened the established order, in which labour had been cheap and plentiful, and the lower orders had known their place, and it alarmed the landowners and authorities who depended on cheap and obedient labour, and who saw their accustomed advantages slipping away. The response was an attempt to legislate against these changes, to hold back by law the economic forces the plague had unleashed. Rules were introduced seeking to fix wages at their old levels, to forbid workers from demanding or accepting more than they had been paid before the pestilence, to prevent them from leaving their employment or their locality in search of better terms, to compel them to work for those who required their labour at the old rates. These laws aimed to freeze the labour market in its pre-plague condition, to deny the surviving workers the advantages their scarcity had given them, and to preserve the old order of cheap and available labour against the pressures of the new reality. They represented an attempt by the powerful to use the law to resist economic change and to keep the lower orders in their accustomed place. These rules were resented and resisted, and they proved difficult to enforce against the powerful economic forces they sought to oppose. Workers continued to seek better terms, to move in search of higher wages, to take advantage of their new scarcity, and the attempt to hold back these changes by law met with widespread evasion and growing anger. The labour laws became one of the grievances that fed into the great social unrest of the period. The resentment of the lower orders at the attempt to deny them the benefits of their changed circumstances and to keep them bound to the old conditions. The rules could slow but not stop the transformations the plague had set in motion, and the tension between the law and the new reality contributed to the upheavals of the age. The labour laws that followed the plague reveal the medieval order under stress, the powerful reaching for the familiar tool of rule and regulation to preserve their advantages against the pressures of a transformed world. They show how the web of rules could be deployed not only to maintain an ancient and accepted order, but to resist change, to hold back economic forces, to keep the lower orders in a subjection that circumstances were beginning to loosen. And they remind us that the great web of medieval rules was not static but contested, a matter of struggle between those who sought to bind and those who sought to be free, a struggle that the catastrophe of the plague had thrown into sharp relief. Let that picture of the contested order settle in the dark. We turn now to ask what lay behind this whole vast structure of rules, why the medieval world bound itself so tightly. Beyond the great structures of law and obligation, beyond the rules of lord and king and church, the medieval world was woven through with countless smaller rules, the local regulations and customs of village and town that governed the ordinary frictions of daily life, the endless small business of living together in close community. These humbler rules, recorded in the rolls of the manor courts and the ordinances of the towns, give us perhaps the most vivid and intimate picture of all of how thoroughly the medieval world was governed, reaching into the smallest details of everyday existence. In the village, the common life of the farming community required a great many rules to function, and these were enforced through the manor court and the customs of the community. There were rules about the use of the common lands, the shared pastures and fields on which the village depended, governing how many animals each person could graze, when and where they could be grazed, so that the common resource was not overburdened and ruined. There were rules about the great open fields in which the villagers held their scattered strips, requiring everyone to follow the same patterns of ploughing and planting and harvesting, since the strips were intermingled and one person's actions affected their neighbours. There were rules about gleaning, about who could gather the leftover grain after the harvest and when, protecting this important resource for the poor. The whole intricate cooperation of village agriculture depended on rules, and those who broke them, who grazed too many animals or harvested out of turn or trespassed on common rights, would answer for it in the manor court. In the towns, a different but equally dense thicket of local rules governed the crowded life of the urban community. There were rules about cleanliness and waste, about where rubbish and filth could be deposited, attempts to manage the sanitation of crowded towns where waste was a constant problem. There were rules about animals in the streets, about the keeping of pigs and other beasts, which could become a nuisance or a danger in the close quarters of the town. There were rules about building, about the materials that could be used and the ways structures could be raised, often aimed at reducing the ever-present danger of fire. There were rules about trade and markets, about where and when and how goods could be sold, about the proper conduct of commerce. The town, like the village, was governed by a multitude of local regulations addressing the practical problems of communal life. Many of these smaller rules can seem quaint or amusing to us now. The regulations about straying pigs and overgrazed commons and misplaced dung heaps, the small change of medieval governance. But they reveal something important, the sheer reach of regulation into the texture of daily life, the way the medieval community sought to govern even the smallest aspects of living together, the friction and cooperation of people sharing fields and streets and resources. These were the rules that ordinary people encountered most often, the regulations that touched their daily lives most directly, the small obligations and prohibitions that governed the business of farming and trading and simply coexisting in a crowded world. They were the fine threads of the great web, the everyday governance that bound people in the smallest matters. For the medieval person, these smaller rules were the most constant companions of daily life, more present and more frequently encountered than the great dramas of forest law or heresy or outlawry. The villager navigating the rules of the common fields, the townsman minding the regulations about waste and animals and building, lived within a dense fabric of local rule that governed the ordinary business of existence. It is in these humble regulations, perhaps, that we see most clearly just how thoroughly the medieval world was governed, how deeply the impulse to order reached into the texture of everyday life, binding people in matters great and small alike. Let that picture of the finely governed daily life settle in the dark. We turn now to the rules that governed even death itself. The medieval web of rules did not release its hold even at the moment of death, but reached beyond it, governing how a person died, how they were buried, and what became of their soul, surrounding the great passage out of life with obligations and requirements as dense as those that governed life itself. For the medieval Christian, death was not an end but a transition, a passage to the eternal fate of the soul, and the rules surrounding it reflected the enormous importance attached to a proper Christian death and burial. The dying person was expected to make a proper end, to receive the last rites of the Church, to confess their sins and be reconciled, to be prepared for death in the manner the Church prescribed. To die properly, with the ministrations of the Church, was a matter of profound importance, affecting the fate of the soul, and the failure to make such an end, to die suddenly or unprepared or outside the Church's grace, was a fearful thing. The deathbed was a scene governed by religious expectation, the dying person attended if possible by a priest, guided through the proper preparations for death, the whole passage framed by the rites and requirements of the Church. Burial too was governed by rule, and above all by the requirement that the Christian be buried in consecrated ground, in the holy earth of the churchyard, set apart and blessed for the purpose. To be buried in consecrated ground was the proper and necessary fate of the Christian dead, and to be denied it was a terrible thing, a mark of exclusion from the community of the faithful, even in death. Certain people could be denied burial in consecrated ground, those who had died outside the Church's grace, the excommunicated, and others whose deaths or lives placed them beyond the pale, and this denial was a grave matter, a casting out that extended beyond death itself. The disposal of the dead was thus a matter of religious rule, governed by the requirement of consecrated burial and the possibility of its denial. There were also the dues and obligations surrounding death, the payments owed to the Church and others at the passing of a person. There was, in many places, a customary payment owed to the Church at death, a mortuary, often the second best beast, or another valued possession, claimed as a due at the funeral. There were the costs and obligations of the funeral itself, the masses and prayers for the soul of the departed, which the medieval Christian was deeply concerned to secure, believing that the prayers of the living could aid the soul of the dead in the afterlife. The desire to provide for prayers and masses after death, to ease the soul's passage and shorten its time of suffering in the world beyond, was a powerful concern, and it generated its own obligations and arrangements, the dying person seeking to ensure that they would be prayed for after they were gone. The rules around death reveal how completely the medieval world was governed by its religious vision, how even the passage out of life was surrounded by obligation and requirement. governed by the church, and shaped by the overwhelming concern with the fate of the soul. From the deathbed to the grave and beyond, the medieval person was bound by rules, required to make a proper Christian end, to be buried in the proper way, to provide for the proper prayers, the great web of regulation extending even into death and the world beyond. It is a final, striking testament to the thoroughness of the medieval order, that it governed not only the whole of life, but the passage out of it, surrounding death itself with the dense fabric of rule that bound the medieval world. Let that solemn picture settle in the dark. We turn now to ask the great question that all of this raises: why the medieval world bound itself so very tightly? Having wandered through this vast thicket of medieval rules, from the Lord's law to the king's forest, from the regulation of bread to the policing of belief, from the duties of labour to the rules of death, we may well pause and ask the deeper question that all of it raises: why? Why did the medieval world bind itself so tightly, surround every aspect of life with such a dense web of rules and obligations, govern its people so thoroughly in matters great and small? The answer takes us into the very heart of the medieval mind and its understanding of the world. Part of the answer lies in the medieval vision of order itself, the deep conviction that society was, or should be, a fixed and divinely ordained structure, in which everyone had their proper place and their proper duties, and in which the whole purpose of law and custom was to maintain this order against the ever-present threat of chaos. The medieval mind tended to see the social hierarchy, the divisions of rank and the assignment of duties, not as arbitrary human arrangements, but as part of the natural and divine order of the world, a reflection of the order of the cosmos itself. To maintain this order, to keep everyone in their proper place performing their proper duties, was therefore a matter of the highest importance, almost a sacred obligation, and the dense web of rules was the means by which this order was preserved. The rules existed to hold society in its proper shape, to prevent the disorder and confusion that would follow if people abandoned their places and duties. Part of the answer lies in the conditions of medieval life, in the scarcity and precariousness of a world that lived close to the edge of survival. In a world where resources were limited, where a bad harvest could mean famine, where the margins of survival were thin, the careful regulation of resources and labour and trade could seem a matter of necessity, a way of ensuring that the precious necessities of life were fairly shared and not engrossed by the greedy, that the common resources were not ruined by overuse, that the labour needed to sustain society was performed. Many of the rules can be understood as responses to scarcity, attempts to manage limited resources and to ensure the survival and functioning of the community in a hard and precarious world. Part of the answer lies in the overwhelming role of religion, in the all-encompassing presence of the Church and the Christian faith, which framed the entire medieval understanding of life and its purpose. In a world that believed, with total conviction, that this life was a brief passage to an eternal fate, that the salvation of the soul was the supreme concern, and that correct belief and conduct were necessary for that salvation, it followed naturally that the regulation of belief and conduct, the enforcement of religious observance and moral discipline, was a matter of the most profound importance. The rules of the Church, governing belief and worship and morality, and the calendar and marriage and death, flowed from this conviction that the eternal fate of souls was at stake, and that the proper governance of life was necessary to secure it. And part of the answer, surely, lies in the simple realities of power and control, in the interests of those who held authority in maintaining a system that served them, that kept the lower orders in their place, and preserved the advantages of the powerful. The web of rules was not a neutral structure, but one that distributed burdens and benefits unequally, that bound the peasant to his labour and the worker to his place, while securing the position of lord and king and church. The rules served the interests of the powerful as well as the order of society, and the impulse to maintain and extend them was bound up with the interests of those who benefited from them. The medieval order was, among other things, a structure of power, and its rules helped to preserve that structure. Let these reflections settle in the dark. We turn now to a surprising truth about that structure, that even the mighty were bound by it. It would be easy to imagine that the great web of medieval rules bound only the lower orders, the peasants and workers and ordinary people, while the powerful, the lords and kings, stood above it all, free to do as they pleased. But this would be a misunderstanding of the medieval order, for one of its most important features was the principle that everyone, even the greatest, was bound by rules and obligations, that the powerful too had their duties and their constraints, and that the whole structure rested on a web of mutual obligation that reached even to the top. The feudal order, in its ideal form, was a structure of reciprocal obligation, in which the bonds between lord and vassal ran in both directions. The vassal owed his lord service and loyalty, but the lord in turn owed his vassal protection, justice, and the maintenance of his rights. The great lord who held land from the king owed the king service, but the king in turn owed his great men protection and the respect of their rights and customs. The whole structure was, in principle, a web of mutual obligation, in which authority came with duties as well as rights, in which the powerful were bound to those below them, as well as those below being bound to them. The lord who failed in his obligations to his vassals, who denied them justice or protection, or violated their rights, was himself in breach of the order, and could face the consequences of having broken the bonds that held the structure together. Even the king, the greatest of all, was understood to be bound by law and custom, not free to do entirely as he pleased. The medieval ideal held that the king too was under the law, obliged to govern according to the established customs and laws of the realm, to respect the rights of his subjects, to rule justly rather than arbitrarily. A king who governed tyrannically, who trampled on the customs and rights of his people, who ruled by mere will rather than according to law, was understood to be violating the proper order, and such conduct could provoke resistance, the demand that the king return to lawful governance, even the forcing of the king to acknowledge and respect the rights and customs he had violated. The great medieval struggles over the limits of royal power reflected this principle, the conviction that even the king was bound, that authority was not the same as absolute and arbitrary power, that the mighty too had their constraints. This principle, that even the powerful were bound by rules and obligations, was a crucial feature of the medieval order, and it tempered, at least in principle, the harshness of a system that bore so heavily on the lower orders. The web of rules was not simply a structure of oppression imposed from above on a powerless populace, but a web of mutual obligation in which everyone, in theory, had their duties and their rights, in which the powerful too were bound, in which authority came with responsibility. The reality, of course, often fell far short of the ideal, and the powerful frequently abused their position and escaped the constraints that were supposed to bind them. But the principle mattered, the idea that no one, not even the king, stood entirely above the rules, that the whole order rested on mutual obligation rather than mere arbitrary power. For all the harshness of the medieval order, then, there was woven into it this important principle of mutual obligation, this idea that the web of rules bound everyone, that the powerful had duties as well as rights, that even the mighty were not entirely free. It reflected a vision of society as an ordered structure of reciprocal obligation rather than mere domination, a structure in which everyone, high and low, had their proper place and their proper duties within the great web that bound them all. Let that principle settle in the dark, the web that bound even the king. We turn now to consider how, over the long centuries, this dense web of rules began at last to loosen. The dense web of rules that bound the medieval world did not last forever. Over the long centuries, slowly and unevenly, it began to loosen, to fray. to give way before the great forces of change that were transforming the world, until at last much of the medieval order of rules and obligations had dissolved or been transformed into something new. The story of how the web loosened is the story of the passing of the medieval world itself, and it is worth tracing, for it shows that even the most thoroughly governed order is not eternal. One of the great solvents of the medieval order was money, the slow spread of a money economy that gradually dissolved the old bonds of obligation and service. As money became more widespread and important, the old arrangements based on labour services and obligations in kind began to give way to arrangements based on cash, on rents, and wages paid in money. The peasant who had owed labour to his lord might come instead to pay rent in cash and work for himself, the bond of personal obligation loosening into a more impersonal economic relationship. Money dissolved the old ties, replacing the dense web of personal obligation with the more flexible and impersonal relations of cash. And as it spread, the old structures of service and obligation slowly eroded. The growth of towns and trade was another great force of change, creating spaces and ways of life that did not fit the old rural order of lords and peasants and manorial obligation. The towns, with their merchants and craftsmen, their markets and their relative freedoms, were a different kind of world from the manor, and as they grew in size and importance, they created an expanding sphere of life beyond the reach of the old manorial rules. The famous principle that a serf who escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day might gain his freedom captures something of this, the way the towns offered an escape from the old bonds, a space of greater liberty into which people could flee from the obligations of the manor. The rise of urban life eroded the old order, creating new ways of living that the medieval web of rules had not been made to govern. The great catastrophe of the plague, as we have seen, dealt a heavy blow to the old order, shattering the demographic conditions on which it rested and unleashing forces that the attempt to legislate against could not contain. The scarcity of labour that followed the pestilence shifted the balance of power, gave the lower orders new leverage, and accelerated the dissolution of the old bonds of serfdom and obligation. The attempts to hold back these changes by law largely failed, and over the generations that followed, the institution of serfdom withered and declined, the peasants slowly winning free of the old bonds, the dense web of manorial obligation gradually loosening its grip. The world that emerged was a different one, in which the old structures of personal obligation had given way to new arrangements. The loosening of the web was a slow and uneven process, stretching across centuries, varying from place to place, advancing and sometimes retreating, but its overall direction was clear. The dense medieval order of rules and obligations, of serfdom and service and personal bondage, gradually dissolved, giving way to new ways of living and new kinds of relationship. The forest laws softened, the labour bonds loosened, serfdom withered, the money economy spread, the towns grew, and slowly the medieval world passed into something new. The great web that had bound the medieval person so tightly was not eternal after all, but a historical structure that arose, endured for a long age, and then slowly came undone. Let that long process of loosening settle in the dark. We turn now to ask what all these rules in the end reveal about the people who lived among them. We have spent this long night wandering through the rules that bound the medieval world, and it is worth pausing, before we let it all go, to ask what these rules reveal about the people who lived among them, the ordinary men and women whose lives were shaped by this dense web of obligation and prohibition. For behind every rule was a human life, lived within the constraints the rules imposed, and the rules tell us much about what that life was like, and about the people who endured it. The first thing the rules reveal is the sheer constraint of medieval life, the degree to which the ordinary person was bound, hemmed in, governed at every turn. To live in the medieval world was to live inside limits, to have one's labour, one's movement, one's belief, one's dress, one's trade, one's marriage, even one's death, shaped and constrained by rules one had little power to change. The freedom we take for granted, the broad liberty to live as we choose, was largely absent, replaced by a dense fabric of obligation that bound the person to their place and their duties. The rules reveal a world of profound constraint, in which the individual was subordinated to the order, bound by obligations that reached into every corner of life. But the rules reveal too the persistence and resourcefulness of the people who lived among them, for human beings are not merely passive subjects of the rules that bind them, but find ways to live, to cope, to evade, to resist, to carve out spaces of freedom and dignity within even the most constrained conditions. The records of the medieval courts are full of evidence of people breaking the rules, evading their obligations, grinding their corn in secret handmills, poaching the Lord's game, demanding higher wages despite the law, dressing above their station, finding ways around the constraints that bound them. The rules reveal not only the constraints but the constant human pressure against them, the endless small acts of evasion and resistance by which people asserted themselves against the web that sought to bind them. Behind every rule was not only the power that imposed it, but the people who pushed against it. The rules reveal, also, the values and fears of the medieval world, what it cared about, what it dreaded, what it sought to preserve and to prevent. The obsession with order and hierarchy, the fear of chaos and disorder, the overwhelming concern with the fate of the soul, the anxiety about scarcity and survival, the determination of the powerful to preserve their advantages, all of these are written in the rules, which tell us not only what the medieval world forbade, but what it valued and feared. To read the rules is to read the medieval mind, its deepest convictions and anxieties, its vision of the world and its place in it. The rules are a window into the soul of an age, revealing what it held sacred and what it dreaded, what it sought to build and to defend. And the rules reveal, finally, the common humanity that links us to the people of that distant age. For behind the strange and harsh particulars of medieval rule were human beings not so very different from ourselves, seeking to live their lives, to feed their families, to find their measure of happiness and dignity within the constraints of their world. The peasant evading his obligations, the worker demanding his wage, the ordinary person navigating the web of rules, reaching for some space of freedom and self-determination. These are figures we can recognize, human beings engaged in the universal struggle to live well within the constraints of their circumstances. The rules reveal a world profoundly different from our own, but also a humanity we share, a kinship that reaches across the centuries. Let that recognition settle in the dark. We turn now to look honestly at ourselves, and at the rules that bind us still. It would be easy, having wandered through the strange and often harsh rules of the medieval world, to feel a comfortable sense of distance and superiority, to congratulate ourselves on having left all that behind, on living in a world of freedom where such dense and oppressive regulation is a thing of the past. But before we grow too pleased with ourselves, it is worth turning the mirror around and asking honestly whether the impulse that produced the medieval web of rules is really so foreign to us, or whether it lives on, in different forms, in our own world. For the truth is that we too live among an immense web of rules, far denser in many ways than anything the medieval world knew, governing our conduct in countless matters great and small. We are bound by vast bodies of law, by regulations governing our work, our trade, our movement, our property, our relationships, our health, our safety, reaching into nearly every aspect of our lives. We require licenses and permissions for a great many activities. We fill out forms and submit to inspections. We are governed by rules about what we can build and how we can drive and where we can go and what we can sell and how we must behave in 1,000 situations. The sheer quantity of rules that governs the modern person arguably exceeds anything the medieval world could have imagined, for all that we think of ourselves as free. The forms have changed, of course, and so have many of the purposes. Our rules are less concerned with maintaining a fixed hierarchy of ranks, less concerned with policing belief, less likely to carry the savage penalties of mutilation and burning. Many of our rules aim at protections the medieval world did not pursue, at safety, at fairness, at the prevention of harm, at the management of a complex modern society. But the underlying impulse, the impulse to order human life through rules, to govern conduct, to constrain the individual for the sake of some larger order or good, is recognizably the same impulse that produced the medieval web. We are, like the medieval person, creatures who live among rules, bound by obligations and prohibitions, governed at every turn, for all that the particular rules and their purposes differ. And we should recognize, too, that we still police belief and conduct in our own ways, still enforce conformity to certain norms, still mark out and exclude those who transgress the boundaries our society draws. The particular beliefs and conducts we require and forbid are different from the medieval ones, but the impulse to require and forbid, to enforce conformity, to punish the transgressor, remains. Every society draws its lines, marks its boundaries, enforces its norms, and ours is no exception, however much we differ from the medieval world in where we draw the lines and how we enforce them. The medieval world was not uniquely obsessed with rules and conformity, but simply one expression of a universal human tendency that we share, to bind ourselves and one another with rules, to govern conduct, to enforce the order we value. This recognition should give us a certain humility and a certain kinship with the medieval person, whom we are tempted to regard as a benighted creature bound by absurd and oppressive rules. For we too are bound, we too live among an immense web of regulation, we too enforce conformity and police conduct and mark out transgressors. The medieval world was not a strange aberration of rule-bound oppression from which we have happily escaped, but one expression of a deep and universal human impulse that we share and continue to express in our own forms. To see this is to see the medieval person not as an alien but as a fellow human, bound as we are bound, living among rules as we live among rules, engaged in the same eternal negotiation between the individual and the order that governs them. Let that humbling recognition settle in the dark. We turn now to the freedoms we do possess, the liberties we so easily forget. Having recognized how thoroughly we too are governed by rules, it would be a mistake to conclude that nothing has changed, that we are no freer than the medieval peasant bound to his manor. For there are real and precious freedoms that we possess, and that the medieval person did not. Freedoms so woven into the fabric of our lives that we scarcely notice them, take them entirely for granted, forget that they were ever absent. It is worth pausing, at the end of our long journey, to remember these freedoms, and to feel, perhaps, a quiet gratitude for them. Consider the freedom of movement, the simple liberty to go where we please, to leave our hometown, to travel, to settle wherever we choose, to seek a new life in a new place without anyone's permission. This freedom, which we exercise without a second thought, was denied to the unfree peasant of the medieval world, who was bound to his manor, unable to leave without his lord's permission, pursued as a fugitive if he fled. The liberty to simply pack up and go, to move freely through the world and make our home where we will, is a real and precious freedom that much of humanity, for much of history, did not possess. We carry it lightly, forgetting that it was ever in question, but it is a freedom the medieval person could only have dreamed of. Consider the freedom of belief, the liberty to think as we please about the deepest matters, to hold whatever convictions our reason and conscience lead us to question, to doubt, to dissent, without fear of the courts of the church, or the fire of the heretic. This freedom, the liberty of conscience and of thought, was utterly absent from the medieval world, in which belief was policed and heresy could be fatal. The simple liberty to make up our own minds about religion and the great questions of existence, to believe or not believe as we choose, is a freedom won at great cost over long centuries, and one we now exercise so naturally that we forget how recently and how partially it was achieved, how many suffered for want of it. Consider the freedom to choose our work, our trade, our path in life, to rise or fall by our own efforts, to pursue whatever calling we choose rather than being bound to the station of our birth. The medieval person was largely fixed in their place, the peasant's son a peasant, the trade entered through the rigid path of the guild, the whole structure of society resistant to movement between its ranks. The liberty to choose our own path, to seek to better ourselves, to move between the levels of society according to our efforts and abilities, is a freedom the medieval order largely denied, bound as it was to the vision of a fixed hierarchy in which everyone kept their appointed place. We pursue our chosen path so freely that we forget this liberty was ever in doubt. Consider, too, the freedom to speak our minds, to voice our opinions, to criticize the powerful, to say what we think about those who govern us without fear of dreadful punishment. The medieval person who spoke against the king, who mocked the powerful, who voiced dangerous opinions, did so at real peril, for the spoken word was watched and policed, and to speak wrongly of sacred or powerful things could bring grave consequences. The liberty to speak openly, to question authority aloud, to express our views without dread, is a freedom the medieval world largely lacked, and one we exercise so constantly that we forget it was ever denied. It is woven into our daily lives, this freedom of the tongue, and yet it too was won slowly, and held by many before us, only in silence and at risk. These freedoms, and others like them, are real, precious, and easily forgotten, woven so deeply into our lives that we cease to notice them, take them as simply the natural condition of existence. But they are not natural or inevitable at all. They were absent from the medieval world and from much of human history, and they were won slowly, painfully, over long ages of struggle. To remember the dense web of rules that bound the medieval person is to be reminded, by contrast, of the freedoms we possess, to see them freshly, to feel perhaps a quiet gratitude for liberties we usually take for granted. The medieval world, with all its constraints, throws our own freedoms into sharp relief and reminds us not to carry them too carelessly. Let that quiet gratitude settle in the dark. We turn now to one last gentle thought before we drift away entirely. As our long night draws toward its close, let us hold one final, gentle thought, a thought that reaches across all the distance between the medieval world and our own, and finds in the end a deep connection. For all the strangeness of the medieval rules, for all the harshness and the constraint, the people who lived among them were, at bottom, human beings like ourselves. And in contemplating their world, we are contemplating, in a sense, our own ancestors, our own kin, the long human family of which we are a part. The medieval peasant rising before dawn to perform his labour services, the townsman minding the rules of his guild, the worshipper keeping the holy days, the fugitive claiming sanctuary in the church, the worker demanding a fairer wage despite the law. All of these were people not so different from us, seeking to live their lives, to provide for those they loved, to find their measure of meaning and dignity and happiness within the world they were given. They felt the cold of winter mornings and the warmth of summer sun. They loved their children and grieved their dead. They laughed and worried and hoped and feared. They navigated the constraints of their world as we navigate the constraints of ours. Beneath the strange particulars of their rules and their ways, they were our kin, fellow members of the long human story. And the constraints they lived under, the dense web of rules that bound them, were simply their particular version of something every human being faces. the eternal tension between the individual and the order that governs them, between the desire for freedom and the demands of the community, between the self and the rules. We face this tension too, in our own forms, navigating our own web of rules, negotiating our own balance between freedom and constraint. The medieval person's struggle to live well within the bounds of their world is, in this sense, our struggle too. The universal human task of finding meaning and dignity, and a measure of freedom within the constraints of one's time and place. In this we are joined to them, across all the centuries, by a common condition. There is something steadying and gentle in this thought, this sense of connection across the vast distance of time to the people who lived in that far-off age. They are gone now, every one of them, the peasants and the lords, the worshippers and the fugitives, the whole great medieval world dissolved into the past, its rules long since loosened and transformed, its people long at rest. But they were here, they lived, they navigated their world as we navigate ours, and we are their descendants, carrying forward the long human story of which they were a part. To remember them, even through the strange lens of their rules, is to feel our connection to the whole long procession of humanity, the countless generations who lived before us, bound by their own rules, seeking their own freedom, living their own lives. And so we can let them rest now, the people of that distant age, with a kind of tenderness, a recognition of our shared humanity across the centuries. Their world was harsh and strange and bound by rules we can scarcely imagine, but it was a human world, peopled by human beings like ourselves, and in contemplating it, we contemplate our own long story, our own deep past, our own kin. Let that gentle sense of connection settle over you now, warm and quiet, as we prepare at last to let the whole long story go and drift away into sleep. Let it carry you gently toward rest, this thought of the long human family of which you are a part, stretching back through the medieval night and far beyond. We turn now, at last, towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently. The whole long world we have wandered through tonight, the entire dense and strange web of medieval rules. Let it fade, the way the distant past fades, the way the centuries dissolve into a soft and shapeless distance, the lords and the peasants, the forests and the courts, the bells and the bread and the holy days, all growing dim and quiet and far away, until there is only the warm dark, and your own slow breathing, and the gathering tide of sleep. Let the manor courts fall silent, their rolls closed, their judgments long since handed down and forgotten. Let the king's forests grow still and dark, their deer at peace, their harsh laws dissolved into the past. Let the curfew bells fall quiet across the sleeping towns, the fires banked, the streets empty, the long medieval night settling into stillness. Let the whole great procession of that vanished world, all the countless people who lived and laboured and worshipped and struggled within its web of rules, drift gently away into the deep dark of the past, all of them long at rest now, all of them beyond all rules and all constraint, beyond all labour and all care. They are gone, every one of them, the peasants and the lords, the worshippers and the fugitives, centuries and centuries at rest, and there is a great soft quiet where all their striving once was. Let them rest, and now, at last, so can you. Feel the warmth of your bed, soft and safe around you. Feel the weight of the blanket, gentle upon you. Feel how your body is held, how there is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be, no rule to keep, no obligation to perform, no bell to answer, only the soft dark and the deep quiet and the freedom simply to rest. Feel your breathing slow and your shoulders soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip one by one and drift away into the dark like distant lights going out across a sleeping land, until there is only you and the warmth and the deep and rising quiet. You are free, here, in this quiet moment, free of all the rules and all the cares, held by the gentle dark, carried by your own slow breathing towards sleep. There is nothing to keep and nothing to remember, no obligation and no task, only the soft surrender to rest. The whole long story we have travelled, the whole dense web of rules and obligations, can simply be set down now and released, dissolving into the warm and shapeless dark, leaving you free and weightless and at peace, drifting gently down into sleep. There is no rule here now, none at all, nothing you must do and nothing you must not. For one quiet night, the whole long web of obligation has loosened and fallen away, and you are free in the simplest and deepest way, free to do nothing but breathe and rest and drift. Imagine, if it soothes you, the great web itself coming gently undone, all its countless threads loosening and softening and floating away into the dark, the rules dissolving one by one like mist in the morning, until nothing remains to bind you, and you are light and free and weightless, sinking slowly down into the soft, warm quiet. There is nothing to hold and nothing to keep. The web has loosened, and you are free, drifting down and down into the gentle dark of sleep, where no bell rings and no court sits and no obligation waits, only rest, deep and warm and complete. And if any last image still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some quiet manor, some dark forest, some bell ringing far away across the centuries, let it grow soft now, and slow and distant, the way a story fades as you slip past its edge into sleep, the images dimming, the voices receding, the whole long medieval world dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the deep past itself, out into the quiet and gone. Good night, traveller. The old bound world is at peace, all its rules long since dissolved, all its people long at rest, and so, at last, are you. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.